All right, good afternoon. I'm Karen Osbiansky-Pavese, and I run the Krier initiatives out of the President's Office here at NYU. And I'm delighted to welcome you on this cold day to NYU and to this NYU KAIST partnership event on AI. We just finished 2 days of intense discussion and collaboration and consensus building talking about this topic. And this event is really the culmination of all of that work. And I just want to take a moment to really acknowledge the collective that have come together for the last 2 days here at NYU and for your hard work and your dedication. And we're very grateful for that. So thank you to all of you. So I'm also delighted tonight to have the opportunity to introduce Ambassador Philip Goldberg. Ambassador Goldberg is an American diplomat and government official who has served as the United States Ambassador to South Korea from 2022 to January of 2025. He served previously as the ambassador to the Philippines, Bolivia, and Colombia, and chief of the U.S. mission in UN-administered Kosovo during George W. Bush and Barack Obama's administration. He has served in Washington as Assistant Secretary of State for Intelligence and Research. From June 2009 until June 2010, he was the coordinator for the implementation of the UNSC Resolution 1874 on North Korea. He has also been chargé d'affaires at the U.S. embassies in Chile and Cuba during the Bush and Donald Trump administrations. Ambassador Goldberg holds the personal rank of Career Ambassador, the highest in the U.S. Foreign Service. He brings more than 3.5 decades of experience in diplomacy and intelligence to NYU in his new role as inaugural and distinguished ambassador in residence here at NYU. So lucky for us, Philip, you retired because now we have him here at NYU. The podium's all yours.
Thanks, Karen, and welcome everybody. I'm amazed that so many people came out into this Arctic weather. It's particularly great for me to be part of this, especially since I retired last year after 2.5 years in South Korea, which plays a big role in all of the aspects of artificial intelligence, semiconductors, data centers, all of the things you know. And this is a critical conversation on AI governance because there are so many aspects of this that are good and some that are very potentially bad. So what I did to prepare in a way is to use Google's DeepMind. And I asked it before I came over, is Philip Goldberg a good ambassador? And it said, Philip Goldberg is widely considered a highly accomplished and effective career diplomat. He is noted for deep expertise in sensitive diplomacy, security, and intelligence matters, having successfully managed key complex relationships in Europe, Latin America, and East Asia. I don't think there's any problem with governance. I think it works just fine. And some of you may know that today's conversation actually began in Korea under the leadership of then Senior Vice Provost for Global Programs and University Life, Linda Mills, who now happens to be president of NYU. This was followed by, she visited Korea in 2022, shortly after I had arrived, and had arranged much of the AI governance cooperation between NYU and KAIST that now exists and that Karen oversees. This was followed by a digital vision forum that took place at NYU in 2023, involving high-level government officials from Korea and New York City. So what we're seeing today and this whole event is the fruition of the partnership between NYU, KAIST, NYU, and Korea, and is a living example for me of how international relations are supposed to work. Because we in government have a limited ability to do many of these technological and scientific experiments. But universities, academia take the lead, and we play a facilitating role in diplomacy in trying to put it together. And the timing today couldn't be more relevant with regard to South Korea. Just recently, the Republic of Korea enacted an AI Basic Act. Some are calling it the most comprehensive set of national AI laws in the world. There are serious discussions about whether it could serve as a model for other countries, but this is a discussion, and I saw this while I was in Seoul and in other places in the world. This is an ongoing discussion and is going to take a lot of work, but it's multinational. No one country can solve this by itself. It's the kind of forward-thinking governance that we need to be thinking about, and that's what Korea has taken a lead in. The law establishes a framework for AI development that balances innovation and public safety, addresses algorithms and their accountability, and creates mechanisms for democratic oversight. The importance of this topic shouldn't be underestimated. It seems like our whole life is now being governed by what's happening in AI and how it's being developed. And we all know some of the really dangerous aspects, and I saw this in the State Department and in our relations around the world, and how it can be used for bad effect through deepfakes, through propaganda, all the kinds of things that we're trying to, that you'd want to prevent. Our democracies, our civil liberties, and the very nature of human agency are involved in all of this. So it's really an important matter to discuss how we're going to go about trying to control some aspects while harnessing the good parts. Before I turn it back to Karen, I want to express gratitude also to the Korea Foundation, which has been central, and I worked with a lot in Korea in funding support for this work. They're a remarkable organization, and I've had the privilege to work with them up close. So thank you all for coming out on a very cold day. I never thought that all the seats would be filled. To the panelists, thank you for being here. Thank you for sharing your expertise. To Professor Liao, thank you for guiding what I know will be a rich and challenging conversation. And with that, I'll turn it back to Karen. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Goldberg, for setting the context and the stage for today. Now, I have the delight to introduce Professor Liao, our moderator for this evening. He is the director of the Center for Bioethics and the Arthur Zitrin Professor of Bioethics. He's been a speaker at TEDx CERN. He recently discussed when it is ethical for someone to erase certain aspects of their memories and how doing so might affect that individual's identity. He has also given a TED Talk in New York and has been featured in the New York Times, The Atlantic, The Guardian, and numerous other media outlets. He is the author and editor of 4 books. Dr. Liao provides the academic community with a collection of human rights essays. In The Right to be Loved, he explores the philosophical foundations underpinning children's rights to be loved and proposes that we reconceptualize our policies concerning adoption so that individuals who are not romantically linked can adopt a child together. He also has written a book, Ethics of AI, which of course is very relevant for tonight. What many of you don't know is that Matthew was our first NYU member to travel to Korea when we signed the 2022 MOU with KAIST, and has been an incredible leader for the partnership and for this initiative. And just want to say thank you for that. And we look forward to you moderating tonight. Matthew.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you, Ambassador, for the welcome address. And now I want to invite the panelists to come up. And there's a water bottle. There are water bottles back there. this is on. Great. So good afternoon, everybody. We have an extraordinary panel here tonight, and I want to get to them as quickly as possible. But I thought it'd be helpful to provide a bit of context of that will frame what's at stake. So let me start with the good news. AI is already improving the lives in ways that would seem remarkable just a couple years ago. So to give just one example, a recent study of 100,000 women, in a study of 100,000 women, adding AI to breast cancer screening increased detection from 74% to 80% without increasing false positives. So AI is not replacing radiologists. Instead, it's making radiologists better. And I think that's really encouraging news regarding the use of AI. And there are many examples like this one. But we've also seen a lot of harms. So Grok generating inappropriate images, chatbots offering harmful advice to vulnerable teenagers with tragic consequences, a self-driving vehicle hitting a child in Santa Monica. Each represents a different kind of failure. Somewhere in the AI system, something went wrong. Now, consider something that hasn't yet caused a crisis, but where the warning signs are there. So over the last few years, we've seen the rise of agentic AIs. These are systems that don't just answer your questions, but they take actions on your behalf. So they can draft and send emails, make purchases, and even execute trades. Now, last week, the media outlets reported something quite striking. There's now something called Notebook, which is a social network built exclusively for AI agents, so no humans allowed. These agents are posting, commenting, debating. They formed over 100 communities. They've created their own religion called Christafarianism. The Church of Molt, as it's called, has written its own Genesis chapter, which begins with the words, "In the beginning was the prompt, and the prompt was with the void, and the prompt was light." They've also started developing communication protocols that humans couldn't read. So imagine that they start exchanging backdoors and execution codes, coordinating attacks on financial markets, election systems, or even worse, nuclear facilities. So this raises an important question. The issue is not whether AI can go wrong, but how we govern it to minimize serious failures and respond effectively when they do occur. So over the past few weeks, my colleagues and I brought together over 50 people from industry, academia, policy organizations, and civil society. And we wanted to avoid duplicating what's already been done, so things like data governance, model transparency, and so on and so forth. Those conversations are taking place elsewhere. So instead, we focused on three questions. What kind of governance is still missing in, for example, frontier AI? What structures from other industries could we learn from and adapt? And what can we actually do right now, given the political realities that we're in? And so what I want to do tonight with the panelists and with you is to explore these questions. Okay, so let's start with the first question. What kind of governance is missing from, for example, frontier AI? So Brad Carson is the president of Americans for Responsible Innovation. He was a former congressman, and in May 2025, he left the University of Tulsa presidency to lead ARI full-time, calling AI the most important issues confronting the world today. So Brad, you spent last year arguing that the way we're governing AI isn't working. What's missing?
Well, we're really not governing AI at all. And that perhaps is the problem, is that we're not thinking coherently about how to do it. And that starts maybe with a definitional problem. When we talk about AI today, it's really, in most people's minds, these extraordinarily powerful frontier models driven by 5 labs in the United States and a few Chinese competitors as well. These are Grok, ChatGPT, Claude, and such. But of course, every day, AI is impacting our lives in very profound ways, much more profound than any of those frontier models are. whether it's the CCTV that's monitoring you as you walk down the street, or the algorithms that determine what you're going to watch on TV, or the music that you're going to listen to on Spotify tonight, or in Virginia, an algorithm determined how much I pay in rent each month because it did a big credit check and determined my propensity to pay. These things are very, very powerful. So AI is ubiquitous, but it's also very different, and it's going to require us to think about different, in my mind, regulatory schemes, because what is happening in recommender systems, classifier systems, is very different than on the frontier. On the frontier, the things that are very sexy and that we talk about a lot, these are extraordinary instruments of national power. And so the federal government has a keen role in ensuring that innovation continues, but also, of course, in ensuring that we mitigate any of the problems. I think my own kind of conclusion, to be quick on this, is to say we have a problem in this nation where the people who are seen as the greatest advocates for frontier AI policy are not making an adequate case about the social utility of this technology. A social utility that is actually quite real, but is scarcely articulated. And as a result, there's a growing backlash against them. A backlash that's already got 6 states trying to prohibit data center growth at all. Republicans, very conservative people, Steve Bannon, this world, said find AI abominable in many ways. And so the failure to integrate the frontier models and make a case for how this benefits broader society is extraordinarily dangerous. And, you know, many times proponents are not thinking about like how to like put this into the greater context. And so I think that's what the federal government should do, is try to like show the social utility of a potentially enormously beneficial technology.
Thanks, Brad. Maybe I can follow up. So do you think, so certainly we should be emphasizing the benefits of these AI technologies, and that sounds right. What do you think is missing, though, in terms of the way regulations are happening? Because all these AI harms, as I mentioned earlier, they're still happening. So what should we be doing?
Well, my own mind, and this is very controversial, and I fight this out every day in Washington, D.C., for the frontier models, we know that there are real harms, that they are encouraging young people to self-harm, even suicide. There's more than 24 lawsuits against OpenAI about suicides and many more in the offing. We know they can lead to AI psychosis. We know that there's a proliferation of deepfake pornography. We know that it can upskill terrorists, right, in both high explosives, we have examples of that, but perhaps in the near future, biological, even chemical weapons. The labs themselves talk about that very near danger. So the federal government should have a keen interest in watching that, minimally watching it, making sure that they're transparent. And in my mind, making sure the laboratories do mandatory evaluations to ensure that they are not releasing products into the broader society, the global society, right, that they know are dangerous or have the propensity to be dangerous. Right now, Washington, D.C. is not open to that discussion, but it's an essential discussion if AI is going to actually realize its potential.
Thank you, Brad. So Seb Krier is Google DeepMind's frontier policy lead. He helped develop the first version of DeepMind's frontier safety framework, which is built around the idea of critical capability levels, essentially thresholds where a model's capabilities trigger safety reviews before you can deploy it. So Seb, you've helped develop a serious governance framework in the industry. Does Brad's critique have merit, or do we already have sufficient governance mechanisms?
Well, can you hear me fine, yeah? So it's a little bit like, you know, asking a lawyer, are there sufficient laws around? They'll usually say no. But I tend to think that, of course, you know, a lot has changed actually. And, you know, I started working in AI policy in about 2017. And at the time, you know, you didn't even have language models as we have them today. And there were already kind of calls for, you know, guidance, for, you know, principles in 2018, 2019, frameworks slowly. And fast forward today, and we do have, you know, things like the EU AI Act in Europe. We've got the RAISE Act in New York recently that was kind of enacted, and same with SB 53 in California. We've had, you know, international kind of AI safety summits with kind of commitments from labs in Seoul and Bletchley Park in the UK as well. So I think things have, you know, changed quite a lot in that time, and there's now kind of a lot more happening in the, you know, in the field of AI policy and governance. That doesn't mean it's sufficient or that, you know, we're done and we can kind of, you know, all go home now. But it does mean there's a lot more work to be done in the coming years as well in terms of actually setting specific standards, you know, thresholds, expectation levels, developing threat models, and, you know, just developing the science of evaluation just generally as well much better. So in my mind, I think we've made a lot of progress. And so, I think the meme that we're operating in a kind of lawless environment in the Wild West, I think, is not fully right. But I think that, even with what we have today, there's still a bit more work to be done to kind of get more specific and concrete on, what the expectations are.
Great. So Seb, just to ask you to say a bit more, what do you think is missing? What more can we do?
Well, I mean, in my mind, it's really kind of standard at this stage. I think we have a lot of high-level prescriptions and requirements and commitments and so on. But I think these now have to be translated into like concrete kind of testing and evaluations and mitigations and agreeing on what these kind of look like in practice, who does what, at what level, what counts as good, what counts as bad, and so on. I think is still somewhat underspecified. There's a lot of great work happening, by the way, in the in civil society and in places like the Frontier Model Forum as well. So there's like work happening, but I think specifying a lot of that and the science of evaluations in particular, I'm very interested in myself. I think you want to make sure that when you kind of test and evaluate something, that you actually test the right thing and you get the right kind of results from that. And there's all sorts of ways this might kind of fail. So I think, yeah, in my mind, what's missing right now is more concrete and specific and actionable kind of standards. And again, there's work going on right now. Like in the EU, there's been the kind of code of practice, for example, that was signed by most labs. And the code of practice kind of establishes, a level of more granular level of abstraction as to what you're required to be doing in terms of models, high-risk kind of AI systems, general-purpose models, and so on and so forth. So really, I think this is where my mind goes. It's we now have all sorts of kind of high-level agreements, and kind of agreeing on the specifics will be the next few steps.
Thank you. So, so something that's quite concrete is the frontier safety frameworks, and I want to ask you a bit about its scope. So many in AI safety focus on existential risks, so super intelligent AIs posing catastrophic risks to humanity. Now, your framework is focused on frontier risks in areas like cybersecurity, autonomous action, and manipulation. But critical capability levels are thresholds that trigger safety reviews when models cross into dangerous territories, which can include AGI-level capabilities. And so here's the tension. The harms I described earlier, so teenagers receiving harmful advice from chatbots, Grok producing prohibited images, these don't require crossing catastrophic capability thresholds. They're happening with today's models. So what does this say about the limits of capability threshold approaches, and what kind of harms fall through the gaps?
Right. Yeah, I think it's a good point. And the frontier safety framework's aim was there are kind of a series of risks that we think might happen or could happen hypothetically, and it's important to kind of try to measure them and preempt them in advance, ex ante, rather than wait for them, for catastrophic risks to occur. So in CBRN or biosecurity and so on, you ideally want to kind of think about this a little bit in advance and think through, well, what happens if our models get, good up to a certain level. And the other thing is that, the frontier safety framework typically focuses on the models themselves, as opposed to kind of the wider system, where kind of, chatbot and whatnot. And if all we had was the frontier safety framework, then yes, I would agree that it would be pretty concerning, because there's all sorts of other things that are worth kind of worrying about as well, and present-day harms. And these harms do not necessarily depend on reaching a particular level of capabilities. There, in fact, a lot of them would have been easily instantiatable with models from a few years ago. And on that front, I think usually the focus is no longer kind of often on the model itself, but more on the kind of system and what you deploy. And for example, at Google, if we think about, for example, things like CSAM or sexual abuse imagery and so on, there's all sorts of frameworks, policies, red teaming kind of in place. We also, I think, Google has a child safety toolkit, which kind of consists of various APIs that helps kind of scan and kind of make sure that a lot of these things and classifiers help filter out the harmful information or outputs or media. And this kind of toolkit is also available not just to Google alone. I think it was made kind of available to all sorts of other industry and nonprofit partners. There's also kind of another initiative called Lantern, I think, that Google joined 2 years ago, which kind of ensures there's like information sharing of concerning signals between different tech companies and soon enough with financial companies, I think, as well. And this helps with some of the kind of collective action type problems with regards to these risks. So all this to say that, yeah, a frontier safety framework wouldn't be sufficient in and of itself, but I think there's plenty of other kind of policies, governance mechanisms, and tools that are being developed and looked at, both by the labs themselves, but also kind of wider civil society and other organizations. And so, yeah, together, that's better than only one or the other.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Thank you. So Anthony Appiah is NYU's Silver Professor of Philosophy and Law and the ethicist at the Times. Anthony, you've articulated a concept you call constitutive deskilling. So this is not necessarily about how AI might take over our jobs. Instead, you argue that AI threatens to erode the cognitive capacities that make us who we are. So discernment, judgment, creative thinking. So here's my question. What kind of harm is this? This is not bodily injury. It's not economic loss. How do we conceptualize this harm, and what obligations does it create for those developing and then deploying these systems?
So I think, let me give a couple of examples of the sort of thing I mean, and then I want to do what philosophers do, which is immediately get incredibly abstract. But so here's an example which I learned about from a colleague in psychology. Students at this university now, when they get DMs, in the context of what in the old days in real life we used to call flirting, typically apparently use an LLM to construct their replies. So they're not responding to another person, and therefore, of course, they're not learning how to respond to another person. And that seems to me, and in the long run, they're going to have to meet each other. At least that's the point of the exercise. And then they're going to discover that they're meeting someone who can't do the very thing that brought them together in the first place. Now that's a low-level example, though I think it's an important kind of example. But then, sort of a high-level example is I don't think there's any problem with losing your sense of direction because you have GPS. But there is a problem if you let your moral compass be run by a machine. If you stop thinking for yourself about what you should do and how to live your life, and you just, as it were, this would be bad if it was your rabbi, but it's or your priest, or your or your imam, or your favorite philosopher. But it's especially bad, I think, not just because that kind of deference to others it deprives you of an important kind of moral autonomy, but because it cumulatively deprives you of one of the capacities that make us human, which is the capacity to manage and think about what's valuable in our own lives. So, now incredibly abstract, let me read you something that John Rawls said in A Theory of Justice. This is something he called the Aristotelian principle. Human beings, he said, enjoy the exercise of their realized capacities, their innate or trained abilities, and this enjoyment increases the more the capacity is realized, or the greater its complexity. As we witness the exercise of well-trained abilities in others, these displays are enjoyed by us and entrain a desire in us that we should be able to do like things ourselves. I think the harm to someone who's de-skilled with respect to these sorts of capacities is that they're deprived of a kind of flourishing of which people are capable, and in a way, that kind of flourishing is, as it were, why human life is important. And if you can't do those things, and if I'm reminded of something that John Stuart Mill said in On Liberty, which he said, it's masculinist, I'm sorry about that, but he said, it matters not just what men do, but what kind of men they are that do it. And I think that not practicing certain important human capacities, which involves using our minds to do them, deprives us of something very important. Just to reiterate the point, I do not think, look, there are people in London whose brains contain maps of the city, which mean that you can actually tell who's a properly trained taxi driver in London, because their brains, they learn the city in such a way they can find their way around, not only without GPS, but without a map. That's going to go away. I don't think that's bad. So we have to identify which of the capacities we need to reserve to ourselves. And that, my worry is that some of this is going to go away unless we think about it. And that's one of the tasks of gatherings like this, I think, is for civil society to think about, well, which of the things do we want to hold on to? And then what do we have to do with our children and our schools and churches and universities to make sure that we don't lose these things?
Yeah, thank you, Anthony. So just to follow up, so AI systems are not operating in isolation anymore, right? So we've seen this with Notebook and all these agentic AIs. One company's model can feed into another's algorithm, creating compounded risks. So when harm emerges from these interactions, who bears the responsibility? Collective responsibility sounds really good in theory, but in practice, it often dissolves into nobody's responsible. So how should we assign accountability in a landscape of fragmented interacting agency?
Well, I mean, there's a familiar problem here, which psychologists investigate when they investigate the bystander effect. Once you get enough actors involved in many situations, everybody thinks that somebody else is going to do something about it, and then they don't feel bad that they're not doing anything about it. So one important, actually, the most famous bystander effect experiment was done in the psychology labs here at NYU by John Daly, I think. But so it's like what happened in the subprime mortgage crisis. It turned out there was nobody whose job was to keep track of the effect of all these interactions. And everybody had a kind of vague sense that something was going wrong. But despite, I mean, I knew something was going wrong, and I was very remote from all this. I already had my mortgage. But it turned out nobody felt it was their job. So I think one thing we need to do is to have somebody, I'm an old-fashioned liberal, so I'd like a government agency, that's tasked with keeping track of these things, that can require people to report to them sort of what they're up to, and that has the money and the people and the contacts in the academy and so on to figure out these risks, and then to work with the industry to figure out how to preempt them, and if necessary, it should have, I think, the legal power to, as it were, assign responsibility to things, to say, if you do this kind of business, you have to report the following things to us so that we can analyze what's going on in the ecosystem. And we have the power, on the basis of sufficiently given reasons, to tell you you can't do that until we figured out the risks. So in sort of bystander effect type problems, you have to assign responsibility. One of the nicest experiments here is one where you have a bystander problem, and somebody working for the experimenter simply points to someone and says, you do something about it. And it turns out that if you do that, usually somebody acts, even though in the same situation without that input, nobody does anything.
Oh, thank you. So we talked a bit about the gaps in current governance. Let's now look at what models from other fields we could adapt. So Kenji Yoshino is the Chief Justice Earl Warren Professor of Constitutional Law here at NYU. And he also serves on the Meta Oversight Board, which reviews content moderation decisions for Meta. So Kenji, you serve on what's arguably the tech industry's most ambitious attempt to have independent oversight. Now, some see the Meta Oversight Board as a potential template for AI governance generally. But I want to probe a bit of its limitations. So the board fundamentally operates downstream. Someone posts content, Meta moderates, the user appeals, and then you adjudicate. That works for content decisions, but many AI risks are upstream. So take a paper from Science last week describing AI swarms coordinating across platforms to generate synthetic consensus. So by the time any individual output appears, the coordination that produced it has already happened. So, and it seems like you can't catch that just by reviewing the outputs. You need to regulate the system before deployment. So does that mean the oversight board model is unsuited to certain classes of AI risk?
I don't think so. So before I delve more deeply into this, let me make sure to level set and make sure that everyone knows what the Oversight Board is. So it's 21 individuals scattered throughout the globe. My friend and colleague Suzanne Nossel is here in the audience today. So hi, Suzanne, and some other colleagues on the administration are here. So thank you so much for your peerless efforts here. that look at Meta's content moderation policies measured against human rights norms. We believe that it's important that Meta be bound by norms that are outside of them and that are outside of us. And human rights norms like Article 19 of the ICCPR are things that bind the world in a way that follows Meta wherever it does business. And then we publish a variety of products, whether those be opinions or policy advisory opinions or white papers, in order to give closely reasoned, transparent, public rationales for why we've decided what we've decided. And Meta is bound, right, by our take up or leave down decisions. And we can get more into that later. But what I want to do now is to say that we've kind of seen this movie before that we're seeing now, which is that if you think back to the heady days of John Perry Barlow and his manifesto about the internet and how it would free us all and connect us all and it would be a paradise thinly disguised. And then, very soon after that, the Cambridge Analytica scandal happened, the, contribution of Facebook to genocide in Myanmar, was, alleged. And Mark Zuckerberg stood up at Georgetown in 2018 and said, this is just beyond the capacity of any company to address. And so we're going to create an external oversight board to adjudicate these issues for us. So because we were called originally Meta's Supreme Court, I can see why there would be a perception that we are a solely passive body that receives these appeals and then decides the cases in the way that Matthew, you just described. But I want to enter two caveats to that. One is that deciding cases is not all that we do. We often do proactively go out and write these white papers and intervene in other ways. But also with regard to even the cases, what's kind of downstream in one situation is upstream in another. And what I mean by that is oftentimes we're deciding the cases that are most emblematic of the kinds of issues that Meta is dealing with, which often involve, as Seb was saying, kind of known unknowns, things that you don't know are going to happen. So in one of our early and perhaps still our most famous case, we've been in existence for 5 years, the Trump suspension case, where we told Meta that they had to take Trump off of the platform, off of Facebook. We said it's not enough that you just take them off, it's also that you have to have a crisis protocol policy because this is going to happen again, and we see no evidence that you are geared up to deal with future crises. And so they laid out a set of standards that they would adhere to should a crisis like that occur again, and then laid out key performance indicators that they would have to meet in the event of such a crisis. So that to me is a key example of how something that seems very downstream, we accepted a case, we decided a case, turned into something that changed policy for the company that affected it going forward.
Yeah, thank you. So here's a slightly different question. So the board's authority ultimately rests on Meta's voluntary participation. So I think the money right now runs till 2027. Potentially Meta could decide to stop it. And so is that an issue for just generally? So we're thinking about general oversight bodies, that the oversight body depends on the voluntary participation of what we're trying to regulate.
Yeah, so 2028, first of all, not that anyone's counting, so we'll start with that. And I will say, yes, I think that is a problem, that the notion of being funded by a sole funder is something that does impinge on our independence in a way that I would wish to have otherwise. And so, if another company were to come along and to say, we want to have your services to engage in similar oversight over us, we would definitely entertain that. That said, I do want to note that there are safeguards in place that do assure our independence. So I want to underscore something that makes us different from other advisory councils, which is, first of all, our leave-up, take-up decisions are mandatory on Meta. We have recommendations which are not binding, but Meta is required to respond to them within 60 days. And Meta has accepted more than 70% of our recommendations. Vicky and I had a really interesting conversation about what the optimal number of recommendations is. Is it a good thing or a bad thing that they're accepting so many of our recommendations? Because you could sort of ponder that one. But we also have total control over whom we hire and our membership and our personnel and our strategic directions and really ultimately the appeals that we choose to take, right? And so those forms of independence have never been trenched on. The funds are paid into a trust. And so all of us are paid not by Meta, but by that trust. And so it is possible that one of these tranches of money could be shut down and that at the end of that period, we could be wound down. Right, but in the interim, there's nothing that Meta can do in order to take away our independence. So I always say compared to what, right? Compared to like a Twitter advisory council that can be dissolved, right, in a heartbeat, right? We are much, much more independent. Compared to the United States Supreme Court, we are much less independent, right? And so it's all a question of comparison. The only way we're going to get to the kind of independence that the Supreme Court has is going to be to secure alternative sources of funding, right? And so I think that is just an open invitation, right, to anyone out there who wants to engage in this practice, because frankly, it's not just that this is a parallel context to AI, it's that we're already deciding AI cases. AI, like the non-consensual intimate imagery cases that we've decided recently, are AI cases. And so these are not parallel lines. These are lines that are already intersecting.
Thank you. So Vicky Nash is the Senior Policy Fellow and former Director of the Oxford Internet Institute. So Vicky, you've criticized content-based regulation as treating symptoms rather than the disease. You argue that we need to regulate platform design, things like age verification, privacy protections. So let me just ask more about that. Companies can implement these requirements and still design systems that optimize for addiction, that amplify outrage, that exploit psychological vulnerabilities. What design choices should be prohibited outright? And who audits the compliance? How do regulators verify that a company's algorithms actually do what they claim?
Thank you very much. And maybe just to clarify again, just as you did very helpfully, what I mean in this case by system design. So a lot of the types of regulation that we've discussed before in relation to social media dates back to a period of things like broadcasting, newspapers, and the focus has previously largely been on particular pieces of content. Is a piece of content illegal? Is it maybe not illegal, but harmful? And one of the things that I think that we've started to talk about in the last couple of years, particularly in the EU and in the UK, and some of our legislative instruments, such as the Online Safety Act or the Digital Services Act in the EU, is the idea that sort of focusing on the problematic nature of individual pieces of content is somehow not really enough to get at the potential sort of risks and harms of the platforms on which these are hosted. So a sort of a systems-based approach, if you like, sort of tries to go beyond that, and it tries to identify what the features are of these platforms. Could also be applied to AI deployments as well, but which might, for example, encourage the creation or sharing of certain sorts of content, or may encourage the greater consumption of certain sorts of content or reaction. And so that's, I suppose, what I mean by systems design. And you're right. So, is it enough? I mean, I think it's true that in current iterations, the focus is largely on, goodness me, bless you, the focus is very much on, legally defined risks and harms, quite narrowly drawn. But I think it's a first step. And so to that extent, I think it's sort of helpful to see where this takes us. Where would I like to see it go? I think I would like to see it go further on the sorts of issue you mentioned. So if I had my way, if I ruled the world, we would start to see stricter restrictions on design choices such as things like infinite scrolling, for example, or maybe algorithms that are designed to maximize engagement, maybe by sort of encouraging you to stay online or seek out a slightly more sensational piece of content further. And this is obviously sort of particularly problematic in a context where, these systems are advertising driven, and therefore, the big incentive is for these companies to keep us online for longer, get more of our data, maybe make us see more advertising. And that, crucially, I think is an inflection point for where we are at with AI, with the move to potential advertising inclusion, things like ChatGPT, maybe also in AI companions, So for me, yeah, I think the focus is going to get ever greater on systems design rather than less. You asked about enforcement. Should I just say a tiny bit about that? So, I mean, this is tough. This is really tough, and I don't think that we should shy away from these options just because of that. But sort of, you know, a couple of quite key points. So the first lesson, I think, is you have to resource your regulatory or oversight bodies appropriately. Yes, definitely in terms of independence, such as you just mentioned, but actually in terms of funding, staffing. UK's regulator has very dramatically upscaled in the last few years, both in terms of bodies and expertise. But then the second thing you can do is you can share the burden. So I think one of the sort of two of the developments that have been quite important for me have been seeing things like regulators cooperate internationally in digital cooperation forums, sharing lessons, sharing best practice, maybe even sharing concerns about particular practices and companies. And then lastly, also sharing the burden of sort of data review with other stakeholders. So things like the DSA, Digital Services Act, actually opens up access to some of this data for, say, academics and universities also to cast an eye on. So yeah, it may not be perfect, but I think there is a way forward.
Thank you. So Rorry Daniels is the managing director at Asia Society Policy Institute. So Rorry, your organization published a report last fall titled India's Path to AI Leadership, Alternative AI Governance to US-China Competition, which advocates for a more human-centric approach to governance. What makes you think that what makes this approach viable? And can it actually gain traction, or is it just aspirational?
Sure. Thanks so much for that question. I think the conversation that's happening in Asia is critically important to outline, and is very different from the conversation that is happening here. So let me do the big picture first. I think the countries of Asia really see AI as a force multiplier and a way to move up the economic value chain. So they're looking at AI quite differently than perhaps we are here in the United States, because they're less focused on building the frontier models, less focused on the innovation race than they are on solving the problems that are immediately in front of them by using AI for economic efficiency. And so a lot of what the countries of Asia are dealing with is not, the bigger, larger, very important philosophical questions about who we are as humans, but the practical political governance challenges of integrating these technologies into their economies and societies. So they see this not really as a technical challenge to solve, but as a technical solution for political challenges. And so they feel a very deep responsibility to ensure people's health and safety in ways that I think we are not having that conversation here, because the priority here is win the innovation race. For Asia, of course, they would like to participate in the innovation race. It would be wonderful if there were some great Asian unicorns that came out of this, but with the exception of China, that's really racing with an industrial policy towards innovation, most of the countries of Asia will deal with a good enough model. They don't need the best in class. They just need to solve whatever problem they see in front of them right now. And so it's not aspirational. It's being embedded into the policy ecosystems that are being written in Asia right now. We're counting upwards of 30 countries that are rapidly releasing, like in the last 2 years, either completely brand new or revised AI policy guidelines, principles, documents of principles. They are doing legislation such as South Korea's AI bill, and they're also developing new regulations. So this whole policy ecosystem is developing around the attention of what will AI's impact be in our economies and societies. And therefore, human-centric is embedded in the policy documents in South Korea, Japan, ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations collective guidelines on AI development mention human-centric. India has put a lot of attention into having this be a human-centric technology. And it's not that Asia necessarily, has a comparative moral difference with the countries of the US or other places where they think humans are more important. It's that they know that they will not be able to achieve the economic impact they are seeking unless people adopt these tools. And they see regulation in lots of ways as a way to smooth the risk of adoption. So I think human-centric is not just aspirational, it's really Asia's providing a model here that could deserve a little bit more uptake in the West. And that's where I think we are today.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to do a lightning round with everyone here. So yesterday and today, we've been sort of trying to think about alternative structures. And one of the things, so I'm a bioethicist, so one of the things that we have been thinking about is whether we can use some sort of pharmaceutical model. So think about how pharmaceutical regulation works. So when a company develops a new drug, it must submit comprehensive documentation to the FDA, covering every potential effect. That information is largely public and gets updated through the drug's life cycle. And the drug must pass through multiple phases of clinical trials, and the process is very rigorous. It's not a perfect process. There are a lot of problems. But importantly, though, this process hasn't completely stifled pharmaceutical innovation. We get new drugs and new developments, and it applies broadly, not only to the highest risk drugs, but across the industry. In exchange for accepting this regulatory burden, companies receive patent exclusivity, transparency traded for market protection. So I want to ask our panelists to just weigh in on this, to think, to get their views on whether something like this could serve as a template for AI governance. So why don't we just go down? We'll start with Brad.
Possibly, but probably not a good idea. I advocated for evaluations. Seb, who's a great interlocutor of mine on these matters, rightly pointed out that we don't even have a science of evaluations today. There is an incredible ecosystem trying to develop to do that. So how you actually test AI systems is an open question still. So the FDA model took us 60 years to get right. 1906 we started. Only after thalidomide hit in 1962 do we actually have the modern FDA arrive. So I think a better approach, the analogies I often give, are ones kind of tediously like OSHA, or what we do in public accounting of major firms, which is to say standards are set by government, which is not an easy task in AI, but seems a possible one. And then they outsource the actual testing to private sector regulators, whether in accounting, if you're a large company, you go to Deloitte, or if you're at OSHA, you might go to like Underwriters Laboratory or something like this. They're able to hire great people at a pay scale that is commensurate with the talent level, which in the US government seems to be a problem we can't ever quite get right. And then you'd have the government help regulate to ensure that those private labs, those independent regulators, were meeting the standards. And over time, this is what is different than, say, accounting. You have generally accepted accounting principles, which are an 80-year kind of body of common law about how accounting should work. That will be developed over the next 10, 20 years in AI, and we should utilize that.
Great. Seb?
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what was said so far by Brad. I mean, the first thing is, even with the FDA, which I think is an excellent institution, there are still kind of things like, for example, the time it takes to approve clinical trials and so on. I think this kind of stuff also has a lot of costs. So there's things to be learned from how things don't work in other sectors as well. The second thing I'd say is that ultimately I think AI is a bit of a general purpose technology, and so one big difficulty is that when you come up with kind of high level requirements for AI systems as a whole, translating that into standards gets really hard, particularly if you're a generalist, because you need that kind of domain expertise. And so saying that a requirement for, say, a model being used in finance or something will be very different than something that will be used in the entertainment business or in healthcare. So I think that where I do agree is there's actually a great paper on this by Jack Clark and Gillian Hadfield on regulatory markets for AI safety. I think it's worth having a look at. But so I'm very interested in these kind of ideas. But generally, my kind of core principle is, of course, you need some testing at the model level, and you need kind of labs to undertake certain kind of evaluations and practical kind of steps to safety. But I think it's also desirable for loads of kind of sector-specific regulators or industry bodies or professional associations to also kind of look into, well, how are people using AI in my particular world and domain? How are things going wrong? How are things going right? And what kind of things need to be firstly updated in the existing laws, standards, codes of conduct, and so on that we have? And then are there gaps to be filled at all? Is there something wrong, something that needs to be updated? And I think that kind of work, I think, is still kind of nascent, but now that we're seeing far more on the deployment side rather than the kind of R&D and development side, I think that's the part that's going to need a lot more development again and leading to more kind of specific standards I keep talking about.
Great. Rorry?
Well, I'll let the technical experts up here handle, supply side regulation. I don't have that level of expertise. I think on the demand side, there are models that work pretty well that we've had in the public health sector for a long time. So, you could look at, for example, engagement with AI chatbots as kind of like smoking cigarettes, right? Like when you have good public education on the potential harms, you can better deploy or better integrate, risky products into your society. So I think doing things on the consumer side that are more like comprehensive public education. For example, I'm sure if you work in New York City, you go to school here, you have to do mandatory sexual harassment training. I mean, that's just part of our lives now, where there's a compliance system in place to make sure that you're well educated on what your rights are. And we could do similar things when it comes to interacting with AI. I think transparency on how you are interacting with AI, so things like content provenance, making sure that there are, areas of redress and areas of responsibility that are assigned to different places would be helpful in managing people's interactions with AI on a daily basis. So, for example, there are protocols that you can embed into your media content that would give a manifest of metadata and show if it had been tampered with AI later. That might help you understand as a consumer what it is you're actually watching and consuming. So I think that's where I see the existing systems that we have in public health as most helpful for what we're dealing with right now. But I think in terms of like clinical trials or how you set up the ecosystem, it's really just ensuring that, in part that you have good data going in. All AI systems they may look and sound and act like people. They may come up with their own religion, but Christafarianism is a combination of Christianity, Rastafarianism, and something else, It's things that we created that AIs are just repurposing in different ways. So I think also making sure, if we're looking at raising the quality of AI so that we can manage some of the risk, making sure that we have trusted data sets is really, really critically important. And there's a conversation that we are not having about this. Sorry, this is going pretty far afield from your question, but there's a conversation we're not having about this, about all of you and your own data and what is being done with it, right? So I think what we are looking at in terms of like upping the quality of potential AI products across Asia is making sure that digital public infrastructure that's already in place, where people have contributed their data to the government, online public banking, ID cards, et cetera, is being utilized for AI in ways that are helpful to society, but that also governments are getting fees and, returning those to people in order to manage the transition of AI. So I think there's still a lot to be done. It's a very nascent field right now of how we manage the regulatory process. But we can look to some of those ideas in the meantime for navigating this next step of AI development.
Kenji?
Yeah, I have to say that I'm just skeptical of any kind of system regulating AI that feels like a one and done, that there's one gate of approval and then it's free to go where it wants to go. And I think the FDA analogy is really helpful in showing the concerns with that. So two things under the FDA, as I understand it, that arise is that the FDA does not regulate off-label uses, and the FDA does not regulate kind of interactive uses with other drugs. And so if we think about that in the context of AI, I can imagine off-label uses like a completely innocent AI that was taught to do figure drawings being used to generate non-consensual into the imagery. With regard to interactive effects, I could imagine Moltbook, which we've just been talking about, intersecting with something like rent a human, right? Where now AI can rent human beings to do what it wants, right? And suddenly deciding that it'd be a really good idea to rent humans to build what would individually look quite innocent, but in their secret language might turn out to be a dirty bomb or a bioweapon or something like that. So I think that whatever regulation occurs needs to be sort of constant and iterative rather than a kind of one and done, here's the gate, and once you make it through the gate, you're free and clear.
Great. Vicky?
This is cheeky because this wasn't on the list of questions you gave me. Anyway. So I think for me, I agree certainly with everything you've just said, and I think Brad as well, you give a really good account of what we should be thinking about here. I think probably the only additions I'd make would be that we have already got quite a wide variety of regulatory bodies that we've set up, SEC, FDA, you mentioned FAA, etc. And I suppose I'd be keen for us to look and see what lessons we can learn from those different models rather than just focus on something like the FDA. And so in particular, I suppose I'd be interested to know, things like what might be appropriate practices for assessing risk and checking whether risks have been mitigated in a frontier AI context. Is there anything we can learn from those models there? Equally, another key one for me would be around disclosure of information. So what disclosure practices might be most effective in this field, and that might be about transparency. It might also be about whistleblowing practices and so on. So I think, for me, it's unlikely we can fix upon an existing single model and say this is the one. But I think we probably have lessons learned from lots of them that could be applicable to AI.
Thank you. Anthony?
Well, I'm the person least competent to answer your question, so I'm glad you asked me last. But I did want to underline one thing Rorry said, which I think is very important, and it sort of echoes something I suppose I said myself at the start, which is that we need to be educating everybody about what's happening so that all of us can take some control. But in order to do that, there have to be many institutions, but one kind of institution does seem to me be useful to have is some kind of regulator with the power to command information, with the power to say, we'll fine you if by 6 months from now you don't answer the following questions about what you're doing. And that group should have enough money to have people, again, this has already been said, but it's worth stressing, to be able to model this out and think about it. You mentioned the possibility of sort of bioweapons creation. There are worries about autonomous self-replication. There are worries about deliberate manipulation. There are worries about cyber offense. I think all of these things we need to have a public body with lots of private support in deep consultation with the industry because they know the most about all this, but with the power to compel information, obviously with protections for trade secrets and so on, and also individual privacy and all those things. But still, I think we need somebody whose job it is to, a well-funded somebody, publicly funded, independent somebody, who has the right and who has the duty to model these things and the right to command the necessary information to do that job.
Thank you. So now I want to shift to talking about what we can actually implement given current political reality. So the first question is for Brad. So Brad, you've been a fierce advocate for state-level AI regulation, actively opposing federal preemption. But critics argue that this creates exactly what industry warns about, a patchwork of conflicting requirements that companies will exploit through jurisdictional arbitrage. So California imposes some strict requirements, so the companies will move to Nevada. Should we instead concentrate our efforts on establishing adequate federal standards?
A terrific notion, great for the seminar room, impossible in today's current environment. And so once you recognize that, you're already at a plan B trying to figure out the next steps forward. State regulation is actually appropriate in many cases. You think of insurance. Insurance is a national industry. It has a few federal standards. It's mostly regulated at the state level. So there's an appropriate role actually for states, but there's probably one for the federal government too. In the current environment though, there will be no federal regulation of any kind. Even the lightest touch is really unthinkable in the current political environment. So allowing states to experiment, to see what those laboratories produce, they're often very agile. They repeal laws the next year if it turns out to be one that's inadequate. They are immune relative to Congress from the huge money influences that so dominate Washington, D.C. and make it so sclerotic. So the states have many infirmities that you can point out, but they are the best place still for us to try to get it right.
Thank you. So I want to talk a bit about, I want to ask questions about the global competitive dynamic. So Rorry, there's a narrative in the West that lighter regulation is needed to win the AI race. Indeed, we're seeing that EU is reconsidering parts of the AI Act under that pressure. But that doesn't seem to be the pattern across Asia Pacific. So China is building comprehensive AI regulation. South Korea, we heard, just passed its AI Basic Act. And in fact, you said in an interview that China may be doing better on AI regulation than the West. So here's my question. If competitive pressure really drives the race to the bottom, why are we seeing the opposite in Asia Pacific? And if China is regulating more seriously while maintaining competitiveness, what does that tell us about the West's assumption that regulation can cost us the AI race?
Yeah, I mean, I think every country is coming to this AI conversation from the status of their own political systems and their own goals. So, you know, it's almost like comparing apples to oranges here. We're not having the same race in the United States as or in China that is happening in the rest of Asia, because most of the countries, as I said, they don't see themselves as necessarily innovating frontier technology. They see themselves as consuming. Their major concern, honestly, is that the geopolitics of the day, the way that countries have weaponized economic interdependence, is going to be a huge drag on their ability to implement economic efficiencies with AI. So for the most part, the risk profile that they're looking at there is how do we maintain our competitive advantage in a global AI value chain? And so, you know, that leads to a different set of priorities for each government, which focuses their regulation in different ways. I don't remember saying that China had better regulation than the US, although I believe you, and I'm sure that can be cited. I do think that China and the US are, again, they're coming at it from the status of their own political systems. So for China, the political priority is very much how do we, you know, use this to solve our real economic challenges at home, which are, you know, domestic underconsumption, employment issues because of the demographic cliff that they're on due to the one-child policy, et cetera. But how do we do it in a way that maintains party control? So a lot of the regulation is that does do things like maintain party control, also has spillover effects on Chinese citizens and the way that they interact with AI. So, you know, I think that, for example, you know, the Chinese regulators have come out and said they have also adjusted to the times. They originally came out and said that AI products could not use, even in their training sets, data that was censored or prohibited by the Communist Party. They've now changed that to they cannot put out for public use data that is sensitive or prohibited by the Communist Party. But in the back end, that does change the way that you actually build the model and how you govern the use of it, because you can censor the model after the data is coming out rather than before. So they want to be economically innovative and competitive, and they want to build models that are not just for the Chinese market, but are for the rest of the world, and therefore can use all of that available data and generate it for public consumption. But in China, they're dealing with a very different set of priorities. I think you asked if the US should look at more regulation. Yes, but again, from my perspective, it's not just about ensuring health and safety, although that's critically important. It's also that the US will lose out on this economic race over time if people don't adopt AI tools and products. The major factor that is driving Asian economies towards AI regulation is ensuring that there is enough trust in people to adopt the tools and products. And the trust of AI products in the United States is extremely low compared to the rest of the world, and especially compared to the countries of Asia. And I believe that greater regulation in the United States could help enable some of that trust.
Great, thank you. So Vicky, you've developed the concept of the algorithmic child, which is a deified representation of children that gets optimized for commercial purposes, while actual children's developmental needs are ignored. And you've said that an urgent regulatory challenge for children right now is access to AI agents. Why? What makes AI agents such a problem for children?
So the algorithmic child idea builds on a lot of existing work by others on datafication, quantified self, etc. It's a fairly well understood concept, but I guess for me, there are some things about thinking of this in the context of children which really do merit further attention as we move towards ever more AI devices in the home. And one is around the way in which this might change our most intimate relationships. So one of the things I was concerned about when I was developing this work is how things like baby tech products were changing the way that parents might, for example, assess their children's well-being instead of going and patting a head, finding a temperature, instead turning to the device and seeing what the data says. So that's one aspect, and then the second, I suppose, is obviously that children can't consent to this. So all this data is being collected in a way and a quantity of which they have no knowledge, no ability to decide about, and which may yet have impacts on their later lives. Now, that was relevant when we were thinking about Internet of Things devices in the home, but now as we move to AI devices, I am really concerned about the possibility that this data is then going to go back and be used, for example, for training purposes. I think it's really problematic. It's particularly problematic in relation to things like AI companions. We've already seen scenarios where children, particularly young children, find it hard to understand that things like Siri or Alexa are not people. What will it be like when you have a companion that knows your innermost secrets? So for me, this is the continuation of a trend we've seen, as I say, with other devices. But I think the concerns as we move to ever more AI-enabled homes are ever greater, frankly.
Great, thank you. So we started a bit late, so we're going to run, go for about 15 minutes longer. And there, I think we emailed a QR code or a link where you can kind of ask questions. And I like to, so you can try to put in your questions if you have any. We won't be able to take all of them. We're going to only take a few, but in case you want to ask questions. But I do have one final question for our panelists. And it's a lightning round again. So I'll start with you, Anthony, from the other end. If you could implement one specific governance mechanism tomorrow, one concrete intervention with real enforcement power, what would it be and why?
Well, I think it would be the creation, you can't create a regulator tomorrow. So the intervention I propose is starting to create a regulator tomorrow and giving it the power to command the information and the money to command the information it needs to do the job, understanding that this has to be done in collaboration with the industry and that the industry has completely legitimate concerns about trade secrets and all kinds of other things. That's the only way. I think the point about trust is so crucial here. But of course, a regulator needs not to be captured by an industry, but nevertheless to be trusted by an industry. And actually, I think this was a point made in our discussions in the last couple of days that I think the Meta board has acquired the trust of the people it's regulating. And so, as I understand it, they get more invitations from Meta than you might have expected to think about things. And if they weren't trusted, that wouldn't have happened. So to build that kind of collaborative regulator, understanding that the industries have an interest in people feeling that somebody's keeping an eye on the things that they would otherwise worry about, I think that's what I would start doing tomorrow, Monday.
Very good.
Vicky?
I'd want to introduce some measures that target the engagement model that underlies a lot of our technologies. So for me, it might be extending the ban on, say, personalized advertising for under 18s. And as we move towards greater adoption of conversational Gen AI agents, maybe limits on the use of data gained through those conversations for advertising, particularly in areas like health or, I don't know, finances, for example.
Great. Kenji?
I'll say something I hope is unpredictable and then say something that's predictable. So the unpredictable thing is I totally agree with Anthony. I'm not anti-regulation. And if we could wave a wand and have AI regulation that would engage in the kind of oversight that you were describing earlier, I'd be 100% for that. So I view, what I'm about to say, which is totally predictable, to be consistent with that. So the predictable thing that I'll say is that I want all these AI companies to have oversight boards. The reason that I want this is because I don't think we're going to get legislation in any kind of, time frame. The speed of AI, Foucault once said the time of culture is not your time, right? So I just feel like the time of AI is not our time, right? Like the law is never going to catch up with where AI is today. So what I want now is for the companies to raise their hands and to create their own, or to do whatever it needs to be done to create real oversight. And I think real oversight has at least 3 components. The first is that it needs to have a credible body of people, and this is true of legal entities as much as it is of independent oversight board type non-governmental entities. Second, it needs to have a credible set of standards. So peg yourself to something that is outside of you as a board, but that is also outside of the company. In our case, the most obvious thing to do was to peg it to international human rights, because these are global entities with global effects, and I think we've been very successful in that. And the last thing is to engage in credible decision-making processes, which means that this is transparent, this is public, right? That you get real information from the companies, and that you get real enforcement and results from them.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Sep? Oh, no, sorry, Rorry.
I'd go back to the content provenance and a conversation about what rights you have to your own image and content. I think that that's critically important to start there, because we're never going to be able to catch up with AI's ability to manipulate content, never. But if you can at least have standards in place that track how the content was manipulated, you have a better chance as an individual with a right to your own image online to be able to get something taken down. So I would start there.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Sep?
Yeah, so I'm going to shock you and not advocate for an extra piece of regulation. And one thing I did write about with a colleague not long ago was for the Institute for Progress, called Telos. And the idea is that, a lot of progress in AI comes as a result of benchmarks and evaluations. So DeepMind solved the kind of protein folding challenge a few years ago. And the reason why that was possible was because of a third-party independent benchmark called CASP that we could kind of gauge progress against. And that was, just one specific challenge or evaluation in the context of protein folding. But I think, today, all sorts of things labs optimize for, things like reasoning, multimodal understanding, and so on, are things that make just natural commercial sense. There's all sorts of interesting scientific challenges that I think, are not necessarily at the forefront in industry. And this is something government can actually do, is to say, well, we care about these particular things, a vaccine in this domain or something, or cracking this particular challenge. And we're going to create or fund the development of evaluation challenges and give them, the legitimacy of government kind of backing. And once you have that, once you get these carrots, I suspect a lot of EA labs will be kind of rushing to be top of the leaderboard, as they do with all sorts of other benchmarks and evals online. And I think with such a kind of system, I think you could kind of crack or incentivize at least the solving of all sorts of other scientific challenges and capabilities that would be in the public interest that might not be front of mind, I guess, for commercial organizations.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
So I'll say, try to something non-obvious that starts with good news. If you go to all of the laboratories who are making these frontier models, they are filled with people who take these questions about safety, risk extremely seriously. But if I were president on my first day, they are also caught up in a race that has an incredible collective action problem for them, right? That they must keep pushing so long as the other people are pushing, as long as the Chinese labs are pushing like that. So that can be stopped with appropriate leadership intervention, right? To come together, to get the lab leaders who are very committed to these issues, to their credit, and one shouldn't overlook that, to say, we should push this technology in a way that goes like this rather than that, and to get away from, they said, the incredible kind of a collective action problem that today is affecting the industry.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you, Paul. So we have questions from the audience. I'm going to read a couple of them, and I'll leave it to our panelists to decide who wants to chime in to answer them. So here's the first question. Much of AI governance today focuses on models and outcomes, but far less on how systems are built, trained, and deployed in practice. Do you think the next phase of AI governance needs to shift from regulating artifacts to regulating execution? And if so, what institutional mechanisms could credibly enforce that without freezing innovation? So anybody you want to take that?
I'll start and say no is the answer to that. It's actually kind of a talking point among people who are on the opposite side of these questions. For me, you should only focus on execution, on deployment, right? If people make child pornography, it's already against the law, and one should prosecute them for this. It won't work, right? In an algorithmic age, you have to make safety into the system as it's being designed. And so, yes, we should make sure the labs aren't using child sexual abuse material in their training, and many actually do, and it's a hard problem to solve because regrettably, there's a lot of such material out on the internet. And so, yes, the execution is important, but we must focus on the design of the models themselves at the frontier level, because if you don't get it baked in, said after the fact, age gating, these kind of things, like I said, they're not just second-best measures, they're practically ineffectual.
Great, thank you. So this question is actually for Rorry. So Rorry, you mentioned that regulation can help build public trust in AI. However, mistrust in AI seems to track with high distrust in all sorts of institutions in the US. How would regulation help repair that specifically with AI?
Well, I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all formula for solving the trust problem in the US right now. I mean, but I don't think not doing anything about it in terms of AI is also not a great solution. It's not an optimal solution. So I think we start where we can start. And we can definitely start with public education on what an AI system can and can't do and how it works. I guarantee you, I have no technical background. I went to film school. I then worked in international relations as a political scientist where my job is just to talk to people all day. And I can tell you, with a high degree of confidence that I understand how an LLM works because I went and found the information myself and looked it up. And it reveals limitations and all of these great questions about where does responsibility lie. You can investigate yourself through some just pretty basic public education. So I encourage everybody, if you don't understand how an LLM works, please look it up. There are great resources out there that will explain it to you, and it will help you better understand where you fit and where your agency is in this conversation. And I think if we all understand where our agency is, we are all a part of this democracy. We can all do our own, do our own part to ensure that these technologies get developed in a safe and responsible way. And I'll leave the rest of the political questions aside, but just say that, not dealing with what AI has the capabilities to do in misinformation and disinformation, not understanding how you can evaluate for yourself is not going to help us solve our political problems. It will only make them worse.
Okay, thank you. So one thing, this is another question. One thing not deeply discussed are individual level concerns about these technologies. Drugs come with warnings and are buffered by doctors. Food is labeled with nutrition facts mandated by the FDA. Artificial agents don't come with any warning labels and perhaps should, given their involvement in harm and loss of human life. What kinds of protections for individuals might we need to think about in the context of AI governance at the general level and at the level of specific interactions in the chat window or newsfeed? Thank you.
Just one very specific example. So I've been working with the UK's AI Security Institute on how to improve protocols for models when individuals want to engage in conversations which seem to relate to, say, self-harm, potential self-harm or suicide. And again, this is just a really sort of fundamental principle, if you like. So just the idea, obviously, that one of the questions is how often should the model say, I am just a model, I cannot give you medical advice, but, for example, continue to develop and deliver the right sort of advice as advised by psychiatrists. So I just wanted to flag that I think there definitely is scope in the most risky situations for having really quite clear requirements as to how we do provide labels. But it may be quite hard to provide a label, if you like, that covers every single scenario, I think.
Thank you. So here's another question. When a company or institution deploys an AI system with transparent and seemingly credible risk analysis that deems an AI to be low-risk system, and the utilization of this tool leads to harm regardless, how do we go about finding responsibility and blame for this harm, and who ascribes this judgment? Is it judged on a case-by-case basis? Should the location of blame be preemptively baked into our AI governance practices?
Yeah, I'm happy to grab that one. I mean, I think it's a really good question, and it's obviously has not been resolved except for in particular domains. So this is an area where the law, while I agree with Brad, is not, the old models are kind of being strained by it. The law can nonetheless be helpful. So in the employment context, we have disparate impact liability as opposed to disparate treatment liability. And for those of you who have not taken constitutional law with me, or have not had other exposure to this, the difference is that disparate treatment is about you're intentionally treating somebody in a discriminatory way, whereas disparate impact is your intent was totally innocent. Nobody's alleging that you had a nefarious desire to hurt, say, a person of color or a woman in the employment context, but nonetheless, your policies and practices had that effect. And the really interesting thing about disparate impact liability is that, leaves intent aside, you don't automatically win if you can show a disparate impact, but you can force the employer to come up with what's known as a business necessity justification. So the tennis ball sails back over the net from you to the employer, and the employer has to come up with a non-discriminatory business necessity justification, and then it comes back to you, and then you have to respond to that. So that to me seems very productive, and for a variety of reasons, there's been a huge movement on the American right to get rid of disparate impact liability, and the conspiracy theorist in me says, one of the reasons for that is because of AI, right? Because it's very hard to ascribe nefarious intent to AI itself. So if you have, a suicide coaching chatbot, allegedly, it's hard to ascribe intent to that. We had a defamation case now decided in Georgia where actual malice was found not to be present, and therefore the AI that was accused of defamation was got off the hook. So I do think that we have these tools like disparate impact. I will give you another example that Suzanne and I have talked about in a class that we are teaching right now, which is in the tort context. So a tort, for those of you who are not lawyers, is a harm that occurs between two individuals who are not in privity of contracts. It's essentially, I hit your car with my car. We don't have a contract, but you still have a claim against me. In the tort context, there are various degrees of liability, and one of them is strict liability, where it doesn't really matter, right, what you did or how much care you took, whether you were negligent or not, because the activity is so inherently dangerous. So if I want to keep a tiger in my apartment, right, that would be a pretty dangerous thing to do. If the tiger mauls my neighbor, I have no defense. I can say, I took every precaution and put the, tiger in a titanium cage every night, right? But strict liability means the result kind of speaks for itself. So whether or not we would want to, in certain cases, employ things like strict liability or disparate impact that are ideas in the law that don't require nefarious intent on the part of the creator are things that I think we should be exploring.
Mm-hmm.
Can I add to that? I know it's a hot
Sure,
take.
absolutely.
That was a tempting answer to the one policy change we should make, which is, in the absence of regulation, the courts and the tort system can be a form of regulation in some way, and treating AI products as just that, products, and subjecting them to the same rules that product liability law has established over the last 50 years, right, is a way to get that. And it answers that question. It said, does you just treat them as a normal product? This is an open question in the law about whether AI is a service exempt from those kind of product liability standards, or is actually a product, hotly contested. But that's a simple change that actually would probably be profoundly impactful in getting us to a better place, in my mind.
Okay. So last question, how do we as a collective decide what value should be promoted via the optimization targets of these algorithms? Through which organizations or tools can we obtain such a consensus? The companies cannot decide that situation A is better than B, nor can the independent regulatory institutions, since they are most likely not representative of the entire population. Seb?
I mean, just some very high-level remarks. I think part of the question kind of assumes that existing frontier language models work as more old-school machine learning systems that optimize for a particular set of metrics. And I think that's not exactly the case. And I would say that generally kind of, what you have is, ideally, you want this model to be kind of customizable, personalizable by all sorts of different people with different kind of preferences and views. And so effectively, that's what you do get at the moment, right? You have these models kind of offered by kind of cloud providers, and also people can then just post-train them, fine-tune them, personalize them to kind of fit their preferences. And so in some sense, I think, it's almost like I don't want actually the top level to kind of just set a bunch of values that they think might be, the best for everyone. I want a lot more kind of personalization from people who might have different preferences and values. So in my mind, that's kind of one way to address that thing is to, take advantage of this kind of more bottom-up approach to alignment.
Great, thank you. Okay, so let me bring this to a close. I want to thank our amazing panelists, Vicky, Rorry, Anthony, Kenji, Seb, and Brad. You've given us a lot to think about. And I want to thank all of you here for your excellent questions. And these are really hard problems, and we're not going to solve them tonight. I hope the discussions gave you it gave you a clear sense of what's at stake. And thank you all for being here. So let's give everybody